The morning mist clung to the Norwegian fjords like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the coastal village of Havenvik as if trying to shield it from what was to come. Astrid Eriksdottir had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to tend the hearth fires in her father's great hall. The salty tang of the North Sea filled her nostrils, carried on winds that whispered of storms brewing beyond the horizon. She should have listened to those whispers. The first cry pierced the morning silence like a blade through silk. Ships, long ships on the water. The watchman's voice cracked with terror, and Astrid's blood turned to ice in her veins. She dropped the bundle of kindling she'd been carrying, the dry wood scattering across the stone floor like the bones of a sacrifice. Through the narrow window, she glimpsed the sleek silhouettes cutting through the morning haze, 3 dragon-proud vessels approaching with predatory grace. The painted shields lining their sides gleamed crimson in the pale light, and she could make out the rhythmic flash of oars as they drove the ships toward shore with relentless purpose. "Father," Astrid's voice rang through the hall, but Erik Magnusson was already striding toward her, his weathered face grim with the weight of inevitable tragedy. "Daughter, listen to me carefully." His calloused hands gripped her shoulders, fingers digging into the coarse wool of her dress. "These are not traitors or emissaries. The raven banners they fly, I know those colors. Bjorn Ironwolf leads this raid." The name sent a chill deeper than any Norwegian winter through Astrid's spine. Even in their remote village, tales of the Iron Wolf had reached their ears, stories of a warrior whose blade thirsted for blood, whose longships brought death to every shore they touched. Some said he was more beast than man, that the wolf spirit possessed his soul in battle. "There's something you must know. Child." Erik's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, his eyes darting toward the approaching danger. "Something I should have told you long ago. Your bloodline. Our family carries an ancient oath, sworn in the time of your great-grandfather. An oath that binds our house to the line of Ironwolf." Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "Father, what are you saying?" "There's no time to explain properly. Just know that if Bjorn Ironwolf discovers who you are, your fate will no longer be your own. Hide yourself, Astrid. Become invisible. Survive." The thunderous crash of splintering wood announced the Vikings' arrival. The great oak doors of the hall exploded inward, and through the smoking breach poured warriors like wolves unleashed from hell itself. Their mail shirts clinked with each movement, their axes caught the firelight, and their battle cries shook the very stones of the walls. At their head strode a figure that seemed carved from the mountains themselves. Bjorn Ironwolf stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of wolf pelt that still bore the beast's snarling head. Beneath the fur, intricate silver arm rings caught the light, speaking of countless victories and plundered treasures. His dark hair was braided with bone beads, and his eyes held the cold fire of glacial ice touched by northern lights. When he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "Erik Magnusson, your reputation as a wealthy jarl precedes you." Astrid pressed herself against the stone wall, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Become invisible." In the chaos, she snatched a servant's rough-spun cloak from a peg near the wall, pulling it over her fine dress and drawing the hood low over her face. She smeared ash from the cold hearth across her cheeks and forehead, darkening her skin and dulling the golden sheen of her hair. The transformation was swift but complete. Where moments before had stood Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of a jarl and keeper of ancient bloodlines, now crouched a trembling serving girl, unremarkable and beneath notice. She watched in horror as her father met Bjorn's challenge with the dignity of a true Norse noble, his hand resting on his sword hilt even as he faced impossible odds. The battle was brief but fierce. Steel rang against steel. War cries mingled with screams of the wounded, and the acrid smell of blood filled the air. When it ended, her father lay still upon the stones he had walked for 40 winters. Astrid bit her lip until she tasted copper, forcing herself to remain silent and visible as the raiders began their methodical looting of everything she had ever called home. "Burn it," Bjorn commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Take what's valuable, put the survivors in chains. We sail with the tide." As flames began to lick at the walls of her childhood home, Astrid found herself herded with the other captives toward the beach. The Iron Wolf's pale eyes swept over the group with calculating coldness, assessing each prisoner's potential value. When his gaze fell upon her, she forced herself to tremble more violently, to appear even smaller and more broken than she felt. "This one's barely worth feeding," one of his warriors observed, gesturing dismissively at Astrid. Bjorn barely glanced in her direction. "She has hands. She can work. Toss her in with the others." And so, with those careless words, Astrid Eriksdottir disappeared from the world. And in her place was born Gunhild the servant, a nameless thrall whose greatest asset was her very insignificance. As the longships pulled away from the burning remains of Havenvik, she clutched her father's final secret to her chest like a burning ember, knowing that the ancient oath that bound her bloodline to Bjorn Ironwolf's would soon shape both their destinies in ways neither could imagine. The North Sea stretched endlessly before them, dark and mysterious as the fate that awaited them all. The longship Fenrir's rage cut through the choppy waters of the North Sea like a blade through flesh, its dragon prow splitting waves that sent spray cascading over the bound prisoners huddled in the vessel's belly. Astrid, now Gunhild to all who might inquire, pressed herself against the rough oak planking, every muscle in her body aching from the cramped position she'd maintained for 2 days and nights. The salt spray stung her eyes and chapped her lips, but she barely noticed these discomforts. Her attention was wholly focused on the man who commanded this floating kingdom of warriors. Bjorn Ironwolf stood at the ship's prow like a figure from the old sagas, his wolfskin cloak whipping in the wind as he guided his vessel through waters that seemed to part before his will alone. "You, girl." The harsh voice belonged to Olaf One-Eye, Bjorn's second in command, a grizzled warrior whose scarred face told stories of 100 battles. "Stop your gawking and get to work. The Jarl's armor needs cleaning and his weapons won't oil themselves." Astrid scrambled to her feet, keeping her eyes downcast as she'd learned to do. "Yes, master. Where shall I?" "In the stern shelter. And be quick about it. The Iron Wolf values his gear above the lives of 10 thralls like you." As she made her way carefully across the swaying deck, Astrid caught fragments of conversation between the warriors. They spoke of their destination, a fortress called Bjornhaven, built on a strategic island that commanded the sea routes between Denmark and the Hebrides. They spoke too of their Jarl's reputation, and with each overheard word, Astrid felt the weight of her secret grow heavier. The stern shelter was a small enclosed space where Bjorn slept and kept his personal possessions. Entering it felt like stepping into a wolf's den, every surface marked by the personality of its dangerous occupant. Shields bearing the scars of battle hung from the walls, alongside maps drawn on stretched sealskin that showed the locations of raids across the northern seas, but it was the armor that commanded her attention, a magnificent byrnie of interlocked rings that gleamed like silver scales. Each ring had been carefully crafted and fitted, the entire garment representing countless hours of master craftsmanship. As her fingers worked the oil into the metal, she found herself wondering about the man who wore it. What drove him to lead these raids? What did he see when he looked out at the endless ocean? "Careful with that, thrall. It's worth more than your entire village was." Astrid's heart nearly stopped. She hadn't heard Bjorn enter the shelter, and now he stood barely an arm's length away, his imposing frame filling the small space like a storm cloud. This close, she could see details that had escaped her notice before, the intricate silver arm rings that marked his status, the careful braiding of his dark hair, the network of scars that crisscrossed his hands and forearms like a map of past battles. "Forgive me, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ship's creaking. "I meant no disrespect." He studied her with those pale eyes, and for a moment Astrid feared he might somehow see through her disguise to the noble blood that flowed in her veins. But then his expression shifted to one of mild annoyance, as if her very existence was a minor inconvenience. "What's your name, girl?" "Gunhild, my lord." "And what skills do you possess besides trembling like a newborn lamb?" Despite her fear, Astrid felt a flicker of her true nature surface. "I can read and write, lord."
"I know the healing arts, and I can work with needle and thread." She caught herself too late.
These were not skills expected of a common thrall, and Bjorn's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. "Reading and writing? Those are noble accomplishments for a serving girl." His voice carried a dangerous edge. "Tell me, Gunhild, what manner of household taught a thrall such elevated skills?" Astrid's mind raced, crafting a lie that might preserve her secret. My mother served in a great hall, lord. The lady of the house was kind, and she allowed me to listen when she taught her own children." It was a reasonable explanation, one that happened often enough in wealthy households. Bjorn seemed to accept it, though his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that made her skin feel burned. "Useful," he murmured finally. "Olaf was right to assign you to my service. See that you justify his confidence." As days passed on the voyage to Bjornhaven, Astrid found herself drawn into an increasingly complex web of deception. Her duties brought her into constant contact with Bjorn, and each interaction was a careful dance of concealment. She cleaned his weapons, maintained his armor, and even helped him tend to the minor wounds that were the inevitable result of a warrior's life. It was during one such moment, as she carefully stitched a cut on his arm that had reopened during sword practice, that she made a discovery that sent ice through her veins. "Hold still, Lord," she murmured, focusing intently on the delicate work. "The wound is deeper than it appeared. You have gentle hands," Bjorn observed, his voice unusually quiet. "And steady ones. My last thrall would have had me bleeding out on the deck by now." As she worked, her eyes caught sight of something that made her breath hitch. There, on the underside of his left arm, was a mark she recognized. A ritual scar in the shape of interlocking wolves, the same symbol that graced the ancient tapestry in her father's hall. The same symbol that her grandmother had described when she spoke of the old oaths, the binding promises made between their bloodlines generations ago. The needle slipped, pricking Bjorn's skin deeper than intended. "Careful, girl," he growled, but his anger faded when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Nothing, Lord, just the light played tricks on my eyes." But even as she spoke the lie, Astrid's mind was reeling. The scar was proof of what her father had tried to tell her in those final moments. Bjorn Ironwolf was indeed bound to her bloodline by oaths older than memory. Promises that neither of them could fully understand or easily break. As she finished tending his wound, wrapping it carefully with clean linen, Astrid became acutely aware of his proximity. Despite everything, the death of her father, the destruction of her home, her current deception, she found herself noticing the way firelight played across his features, the careful intelligence behind his pale eyes, the surprising gentleness in his hands when he wasn't wielding weapons. "There," she said softly, tying off the bandage. "That should heal cleanly, Lord." When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, something passed between them, a connection that had nothing to do with master and thrall, nothing to do with conqueror and captive. It was something deeper, more primal, as if some part of their souls recognized each other despite the deception that lay between them. Then the moment shattered as Olaf's voice boomed across the ship. "Land ahead. Bjornhaven rises from the waves." As they approached the fortress that would become her prison, Astrid realized that her greatest challenge lay not in maintaining her disguise, but in fighting the growing attraction she felt for the very man who had destroyed her world. The ancient oath that bound their bloodlines was already working its mysterious power, drawing them together even as circumstances kept them apart. The dragon ship sailed toward shore, carrying them both toward a destiny that neither could escape. Bjornhaven rose from the gray waters like something from the realm of the gods themselves, its massive stone walls carved directly into the living rock of the island. Watchtowers pierced the sky like spears, their banners snapping in the constant wind that swept across the northern seas. As Fenrir's rage approached the harbor, Astrid could see the evidence of Bjorn's power everywhere. Dozens of longships moored along the wooden piers, warriors training in the courtyard, smithies sending sparks into the salt-tinged air. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Bjorn's voice came from directly beside her, and Astrid started. She hadn't noticed him approach, her attention wholly captured by the fortress that would now be her home. "3 generations of my family built these walls. My grandfather laid the first stones with his own hands. It's impressive, Lord," she replied carefully, remembering to keep her voice properly subdued. But even as she spoke, her mind was cataloging defensive positions and escape routes with the tactical awareness her father had trained into her since childhood. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The prisoners were herded ashore and sorted according to their perceived value. The strong men to work the forges and quarries, the women to serve in the great hall and kitchens. Astrid found herself assigned to Bjorn's personal household, a position that was both blessing and curse. It would keep her close to information and give her access to areas of the fortress that might prove useful. But it also meant constant proximity to a man who seemed to see more than he should. Bjornhaven's great hall dwarfed even her father's impressive dwelling. Massive oak pillars, each carved from a single tree trunk, supported a vaulted ceiling that soared overhead like the ribs of some primordial beast. Tapestries depicting the exploits of Bjorn's ancestors covered the walls, and at the hall's heart burned a fire pit large enough to roast an entire ox. Gunhild. The voice belonged to Helga, an older woman who served as head of Bjorn's household. Her gray hair was bound in tight braids and her sharp eyes missed nothing. You're to tend the Jarl's private quarters. See that his sleeping furs are aired, his weapons properly stored, and his writing materials kept in good order. Astrid nodded obediently, but inwardly she felt a thrill of anticipation. Bjorn's private chambers would surely contain maps, correspondence, perhaps even records that might shed light on the ancient oath that bound their families. If she was careful, she might learn more about her situation, and perhaps find a way to use it to her advantage. The Jarl's quarters occupied an entire floor of the fortress's central tower, accessed by a narrow stone stairway that seemed to climb forever. When she finally reached the heavy oak door, Astrid paused to catch her breath and steel herself for what lay beyond. The chamber was larger than she'd expected, with windows that offered commanding views of the sea in 3 directions. But it was the contents that took her breath away. Scrolls and books, actual books of fortune and knowledge, lined shelves carved into the stone walls. Maps covered a massive oak table, held down at the corners by carved gaming pieces, and there, hanging from a place of honor above the hearth, was a tapestry that made Astrid's blood turn to ice. It depicted 2 wolves, their forms intertwined in an eternal chase beneath stars that formed ancient runes. She knew those runes. Her grandmother had taught them to her in secret, whispering that they held the power to bind souls across time itself. This was no mere decoration. It was a record of the oath, woven into fabric and displayed for all who had eyes to see. Beautiful work, isn't it? Astrid spun around to find Bjorn standing in the doorway, his massive frame filling the opening. How long had he been watching her? How much had he observed? Yes, Lord, she managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. The craftsmanship is exceptional. It was made by my grandmother, using thread spun from wool dyed with berries that grow only in sacred groves. She claimed it told the story of our family's greatest triumph. He moved into the room, his footsteps silent despite his size, though she was always cryptic about what that triumph actually was. As he spoke, Bjorn began removing his traveling gear with the methodical precision of a warrior accustomed to caring for his own equipment. Astrid found herself watching the play of muscles beneath his tunic as he lifted the heavy mail shirt over his head, the way firelight caught the intricate silverwork on his arm rings. Tell me, Gunhild, he said suddenly, not turning around, what do you see when you look at that tapestry? The question was clearly a test, though of what she wasn't certain. Astrid chose her words carefully. I see. Wolves, Lord, chasing each other beneath the stars. Perhaps it represents the eternal hunt or the bonds between warriors. Bjorn turned then, and his pale eyes seemed to look straight through her. An interesting interpretation. My grandmother always said it depicted 2 souls bound by fate, forever circling each other, forever seeking but never finding peace until they accepted their destiny. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with meanings that danced just beyond Astrid's grasp. She found herself taking a step backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. I should tend to your armor, Lord. The salt spray has left marks on the metal. Later. His voice carried absolute command, but there was something else there too. A question, an invitation she didn't dare acknowledge. First, I have a task for you. I need you to read something. He moved to the table, pushing aside the maps to reveal a scroll sealed with red wax. The seal bore the same intertwined wolves as the tapestry, but the wax was fresh, the parchment new. This arrived by Raven just before we departed on the raid, Bjorn said, breaking the seal with careful fingers. It's from an old woman in the Orkney Islands, someone who claims to know my family's history better than I do myself. Her writing is cramped and difficult to decipher. As he unrolled the parchment, Astrid caught sight of the text and felt the blood drain from her face. The letter was written in the old script, the formal language used for matters of law and binding oaths. Even upside down, she could make out enough words to know that this document concerned her, or rather, it concerned the daughter of Eric Magnusson and the ancient promises that bound her bloodline to the House of Ironwolf. Can you read it? Bjorn asked, holding the scroll toward her. Astrid's mind raced. If she revealed that she could read the old script, a skill possessed only by nobles and skalds, it would raise questions she couldn't answer. But if she claimed ignorance, she might miss the only chance she'd have to learn what the letter contained. I can try, Lord. The letters are familiar, though the words are difficult. She took the parchment with hands that trembled only slightly, praying that Bjorn would attribute her nervousness to the weight of the task. As her eyes moved across the text, the words seemed to burn themselves into her mind. To Bjorn, son of Magnus, called Iron Wolf by those who know his fury. The time of the ancient binding draws near. Know that Eric Magnusson is dead by your hand, as was foretold, and his daughter lives still, though hidden from sight. The oath sworn by your ancestors and hers cannot be broken by death or distance. She who bears the blood of the oath weavers must be found. For only through the joining of your houses can the power that was sundered be made whole again. Seek the sign of the interlocked wolves, for it marks those chosen by fate. Well, Bjorn's voice seemed to come from very far away. What does it say? Astrid's mouth had gone completely dry. The letter confirmed everything her father had hinted at in those final moments, but it also revealed the terrifying scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't merely a political alliance or a simple marriage contract. It was something far older and more binding, woven into the very fabric of fate itself. It's difficult to make out, Lord, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about old promises and a binding that cannot be broken. Bjorn's eyes narrowed, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been suspicion cross his features. You read that from this cramped script? Either you're more skilled than you claim, or you're not telling me the complete truth. Before she could respond, the heavy door burst open and Olaf One-Eye stumbled into the chamber, his scarred face flushed with excitement and ale. Bjorn, you must come quickly. There's been a fight in the hall. That new thrall, the one with the scarred hands, he's killed Ragnar in a duel over food portions. The men are calling for blood sport. The moment was broken, and Astrid felt a mixture of relief and frustration as Bjorn's attention shifted to more immediate concerns. As he strode from the room, pausing only to roll up the damning scroll and tuck it into his belt, she realized that her time was running out. The letter had made it clear that others knew of her true identity, and it was only a matter of time before those secrets came to light. That night, as she lay on her bed of straw in the servants' quarters, Astrid stared up at the stone ceiling and wrestled with an impossible choice. She could continue her deception, hiding among the thralls and hoping that her secret would remain safe, or she could reveal herself and trust that the ancient oath would protect her from Bjorn's wrath. Either path led into darkness, but as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself thinking not of escape or revenge, but of the way Bjorn's eyes had looked when he spoke of souls bound by fate. Despite everything that lay between them, despite the gulf of deception and blood that separated their current circumstances, she was beginning to understand that the ancient oath might not be a curse at all. It might be the only path to a destiny neither of them could imagine. There. Morning sun painted Bjornhaven's stones with copper light as Astrid made her way to the great hall, her arms laden with linens for the high table. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she had fallen into the rhythm of her false life with practiced ease. But beneath the surface, tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. The hall buzzed with unusual activity. Warriors clustered around tables laden with maps and weapons, their voices carrying the sharp edge of anticipation. At the hall's center, Bjorn stood like a mountain among lesser peaks, his presence commanding absolute attention as he outlined plans for another raid. The monastery at Lindisfarne grows fat with gold, he was saying, his finger tracing routes across a sealskin chart. Their walls are meant to keep out wolves and bandits, not warriors who've learned their craft in dragon ships. Astrid forced herself to focus on her tasks, but her attention kept drifting to the man whose voice could make her heart race. Even as his words spoke of violence and plunder, she'd grown to know his moods over these weeks. The way his jaw tightened when he was frustrated, how his eyes grew distant when he contemplated something beyond the immediate moment. The rare occasions when his harsh features softened into something approaching gentleness. You there, girl, Helga's sharp voice cut through her reverie. Stop mooning about and fetch more ale from the storerooms. Can't you see the men are thirsty? Heat flooded Astrid's cheeks as several warriors chuckled at her obvious distraction. She hurried toward the door, head down in proper servile fashion, but not before catching Bjorn's eye. Something in his expression made her stumble slightly, a knowing look that seemed to pierce straight through her carefully constructed mask. The storerooms lay deep beneath the hall, carved from the living rock of the island itself. As Astrid descended the narrow stone steps, the sounds of the feast above faded to a distant murmur. The air grew cool and still, heavy with the scent of preserved meat and aging grain. She was struggling to lift a heavy amphora of ale when she heard footsteps on the stairs behind her. The measured tread was unmistakable. Bjorn had followed her into the depths of his fortress. "Allow me," he said simply, reaching around her to grasp the ceramic vessel. His body pressed close against her back for a moment, and Astrid felt a jolt of heat that had nothing to do with the exertion of lifting. "This is too heavy for someone so small." "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady at normal volume. "I didn't mean to struggle with it." "You weren't struggling." His voice carried that dangerous edge she'd come to recognize. "You were thinking. I've watched you, Gunhild, and I see more than mere obedience in your eyes. I see intelligence, calculation, perhaps even judgment." The amphora was set aside, forgotten, as Bjorn turned to face her fully in the cramped space. The single torch on the wall cast dancing shadows across his features, making him look like something from the old stories, a god of war descended to walk among mortals. "Tell me something," he continued, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "How does a thrall learn to read not just the common script, but the old formal language used for legal documents and sacred oaths?" Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. "I told you, Lord. The lady of my former household taught you to read simple texts, perhaps even basic accounts. But the scroll from the Orkneys was written in the ceremonial script, used only by jarls and law speakers. Yet you read it as easily as if it were written in your native tongue." The space seemed to shrink around them, the stone walls pressing closer as Bjorn's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Astrid knew that her deception was crumbling, but still she tried to maintain the facade. "I may have misunderstood what I was reading, Lord. Perhaps I told you incorrectly." "Stop." The single word cut through her protests like an axe through wood. "I've had enough of lies, girl. I know what you are." Before she could react, Bjorn's hand shot out to grasp her left arm, pushing up the rough sleeve of her servant's dress. There, on the pale skin of her forearm, was the mark she'd tried so hard to conceal. A ritual scar in the shape of interlocked wolves, the mirror image of the one she'd discovered on Bjorn's own arm. "This mark," he said softly, his thumb tracing the raised skin with surprising gentleness, "is given only to the daughters of oath-sworn houses, only to those whose bloodlines carry the weight of ancient promises." The last of her defenses crumbled like a dam before the flood. "How long have you known?" "I suspected from the first day when you revealed skills no common thrall should possess. I became certain when you read the letter from Moira, the wise woman." His grip on her arm remained firm but not painful. "She wrote to warn me that Eric Magnusson's daughter had survived the raid, though she didn't know in what guise the girl might be hiding. I know more than that." Bjorn's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the confined space it seemed to fill the air around them. "I know that our bloodlines are bound by oaths sworn when the world was younger, when the gods still walked openly among men. I know that you are the woman fate chose to stand beside me, whether either of us wishes it or not." "And what do you wish?" The question escaped before Astrid could stop it. Born from weeks of confusion and growing attraction she'd tried desperately to deny. For a long moment Bjorn said nothing. Then, with movements as deliberate as a stalking wolf, he reached up to cup her face in his battle-scarred hands. "I wish I understood why looking at you makes me question everything I thought I knew about conquest and victory. I wish I could comprehend how a slip of a girl who should hate me for destroying her world instead makes me want to build new ones just to lay them at her feet." His confession hit her like a physical blow. "You killed my father." "I did. As he would have killed me, given the chance. Such is the way of our people." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones with impossible tenderness. "But the gods work in ways that mortal minds struggle to grasp. Perhaps your father's death was always meant to be the beginning of something greater, not merely an ending." "How can you say that?" Astrid's voice broke. Caught between grief and the traitorous desire his touch awakened in her. "Because when I look at you, truly look at you, I see not a conquered enemy, but something I didn't know I'd been searching for. The other half of a whole I never realized was incomplete. Before she could protest or pull away, Bjorn's mouth claimed hers in a kiss that tasted of fire and inevitability. For a heartbeat, Astrid's world narrowed to the warmth of his lips, the strength of his hands, the way her body seemed to recognize his touch on some level deeper than thought or choice. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. She wrenched herself away, pressing against the stone wall behind her. No, you think you can take everything, my home, my family, my very identity, and then claim me as your reward? The oath may bind our bloodlines, but it doesn't make me yours to command. Bjorn's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps even respect. You're right. The oath binds us together, but it doesn't dictate how that binding must be honored. There are many forms of alliance between houses, many ways that ancient promises can be fulfilled. What are you saying? I'm saying that I won't force you to my bed or to the marriage altar, but I also won't pretend that what exists between us is merely political convenience. The pull I feel toward you, the way my heart races when you're near, that's not the result of some dusty scroll or ancestral promise. That's something real, something that belongs to us alone. Astrid stared at him, seeing not the fearsome iron wolf of legend, but a man struggling with emotions as confused and powerful as her own. And if I choose to honor the oath through some other means, if I refuse to be your bride, then I'll respect that choice. But I'll also continue to hope that you might come to see what I'm beginning to understand, that perhaps the gods, in their wisdom, know better than we do what will make us whole. The sound of approaching footsteps on the stone stairs broke the charged atmosphere. Olaf's voice echoed down from above, calling for his jarl. The moment was shattered, but something fundamental had changed between them. As they made their way back to the great hall, Astrid's mind reeled with the implications of what had transpired. Her secret was revealed, but instead of the punishment or forced marriage she'd feared, she'd been offered something far more dangerous. A choice. The freedom to decide her own fate, even as ancient powers worked to draw her toward a destiny she was only beginning to comprehend. That night, as she lay wakeful on her simple bed, Astrid found herself touching the scar on her arm and remembering the warmth of Bjorn's hands. The oath that bound their bloodlines might be beyond her control, but her heart, that remained hers to give or withhold as she chose. The question that haunted her as dawn approached was whether she was strong enough to resist a pull that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, or whether she was brave enough to embrace a love that might transform them both into something greater than either could be alone. In the great hall above, Bjorn sat before the dying fire, staring into the flames and wrestling with the same impossible questions. The raid on Lindisfarne could wait. He had a more important battle to fight, one that would be won not with sword and axe, but with patience, understanding, and the hope that love could indeed conquer the wounds left by war. The ancient oath had brought them together, but only their hearts could determine what they would build from the ashes of the past. As the North Sea winds howled around the fortress walls, both warrior and woman faced the dawn of a new chapter, one that would test not just their courage in battle, but their willingness to trust in a love that defied every expectation, every boundary their worlds had built between them. For in the end, the greatest conquests were not won on blood-soaked battlefields, but in the quiet moments when two souls recognized their perfect match in each other and chose to forge a bond stronger than any oath sworn by their ancestors. The story of Bjorn Ironwolf and Astrid Eriksdottir had only just begun, written not in ancient runes or formal contracts, but in the language of the heart, a tongue that knew no master save love itself.